Welcome to this explainer. Well, actually, scratch that. Welcome, Wanderer. Because if we're really going to dive into the dark, twisted source material we're unpacking today, I shouldn't even be addressing you as a viewer. As you step across the tree line into the deep woods of this fable, you aren't a guest. You're biological property. And frankly, you are long overdue for collection. Today, we're tearing into a grim, fascinating narrative called The Synthesis of the Sylvan King. It's the kind of story that takes all our cozy modern comforts and strips them away, branch by splintering branch. Let's get right into it.
Right off the bat, we run into the Horned Guardian. Picture this, a towering spirit made entirely of petrified oak and creeping lichen, just staring you down with the cold, sterile light of an unblinking inquisitor. Adopting this completely emotionless clinical tone, the Guardian's whole purpose is to mock our fragile human egos. We absolutely love to think of nature as this gentle, neutral mother, right? We build our little cabins, we go on hikes, we act like the woods are just a playground for us. But the Guardian completely shatters that illusion. To the forest, you're literally just walking compost. Your frantic, busy human life is nothing more than a temporary state before you finally return to the soil.
Which brings us to the core philosophical puzzle of this entire fable. Is the loss of your autonomy a true form of relief? It's a heavy question. The Guardian directly challenges this desperate way we cling to our selfhood. It doesn't frame the common erasure of your identity as murder. No, it frames it as a cure, a deeply logical fix to the sheer friction of existence. Just think for a second about how exhausting it actually is to be an individual. All the constant choices, the unending anxieties, the loud, deafening noise of just living. The Force looks at all that and essentially says, hey, I can fix that for you.
Section 1. Welcome to the workshop, the end of the frantic vibration. So, to understand exactly how the forest plans to fix you, we have to look at what it actually is. It's not a sanctuary. It's a workshop built to silence the loud, discordant noise of what the text calls your frantic vibration. And the main mechanism here is mandatory synthesis. This is the forced predatory assimilation of you, the biological property, back into the permanent matter of the forest floor. When you read the source material, you can almost hear the slow, agonizing creak of splintering bark as your individuality just starts to fail. The forest doesn't see autonomy as a right. It sees it as a sickness, a temporary fever that absolutely needs to be broken. And the only cure? Permanent synthesis with the dirt.
Section 2. The Parables of Ego. Severed Signals and Dissolving Pages. To justify this terrifying process, the text gives us parables showing how our attempts to outsmart the dirt only expose our own frantic panic. First up is the parable of the severed signal. It talks about a tribe that thought their digital networks basically made them gods. We build these massive cities of cold iron, we frantically whisper across oceans on our phones, all just to ignore the biological loneliness of our own flesh. But as this tribe stepped into the deep wood, the silence completely swallowed their echoes. It perfectly illustrates how meaningless our digital connectivity is against the wild. Soon enough, all those frantic signals get replaced by the slow, silent language of rings and roots. All our technology, it's just a tragic, frantic panic to avoid the heavy reality of the dirt. Then we have the parable of the dissolving page, where a scholar tries to bring his logic into the dark. There is an incredibly clever philological connection here. The word humanitas, representing our human refinement and reason, actually shares a root with humus, which means the damp dirt of the earth. So this scholar hauls heavy books on logic into the forest, thinking his reason is this impenetrable fortress. But the forest proves that human reason is just a temporary mask worn by the dirt. The dampness etches away his pages, the ink bleeds right back into the humus, and all that highly prized logic just returns to pulp. Your name, your intellect, it's all destined to be stripped away until absolutely nothing but the root remains.
Section 3. The Parables of Surrender, Rusting Cages and Woven Veins. Once that fragile ego is dismantled, we hit the inescapable physical surrender. The unblinking inquisitor gets everything ready for collection in these next two parables. In the parable of the rusting key, a prisoner builds an iron cage for civilized protection, totally oblivious to the fact that the iron is actually just the biological property of the mountain. The rust blooming on the lock, that's the forest's first whisper of the stitching, the beginning of true assimilation. And then look at the traveler in the parable of the woven vein. He sleeps on a meadow of soft grass, weeping with relief, thinking he found a sanctuary. But that grass isn't a bed. It's the first thread of a predatory assimilation. It goes to show that human industry and our desperate search for sanctuary are always co-opted.
The forest is always patiently waiting to take back what is inherently its own. And that leads us to a really chilling realization. Your identity, what the text calls your heavy, exhausting selfhood, is essentially just a long overdue debt being repaid to the soil. You aren't actually losing your life here. You're just paying a tab you've been running up over decades of frantic vibration. You are finally, inevitably, feeding the beautiful, permanent dream of the forest floor. Section 4. The Subterranean Vault, the Demands of Stillness. As this grim reality really sets in, the Guardian's voice starts fading into this dry papyrus rustle. You're crossing the threshold into this subterranean vault, a garden that no longer tolerates any noise. It demands absolute stillness. Let's map out this terrifying timeline. It kicks off in mere minutes with your frantic vibration and your ego, but as hours tick by, a slow silence rolls in, completely erasing your human logic and digital signals. Give it a few days and the stitching begins. This is your physical surrender, where your iron cages rust out and the grass literally weaves right into your veins, until finally you reach eternity, mandatory synthesis. You are permanently transformed into forest floor matter. The garden cures the illusion of the individual by folding you completely into the whole. Section 5. The Mandatory Synthesis. The Monologue of the Sylvan King. Right here, in the dead stillness of the vault, we finally meet the architect of this ultimate synthesis. We hear the absolute, incredibly heavy voice of the Sylvan King himself, laying out the grim truth of what he calls your salvation. Speaking methodically, directly to you, the biological property, he says, "Look upon the architecture of your end, little wanderer, and see it as the only true salvation you have ever known." It's terrifyingly convincing logic. He frames the absolute loss of your autonomy not as some horrific death sentence, but as the ultimate, peaceful relief from the sickness of selfhood. You've been carrying the heavy burden of being you, and he is offering to just take that weight away forever. Think about it. How often do we talk about wanting to get back to nature, or needing to find our roots, or just starving for something real in this hyper-digital world? Well, the Sylvan King commands you to surrender to the vault, because those roots have finally found you. They are perfectly primed to begin the final stitching. He tells you to stop starving for something real, and to literally become the reality of the forest floor. To really boil down the terrifying beauty of the King's promise, we have to look at what's actually left when this whole process wraps up. The friction of your existence? Resolved. Your heavy, exhausting selfhood? Fully surrendered. You enter into the beautiful, permanent dream of the humus. At the end of this stark fable, there is no king sitting on a grand throne, and there's certainly no traveler left to tell the tale. There is only the synthesis, just the heavy silence and the dirt, which leaves us utterly trapped in the cold, unblinking logic of the forest, just waiting for our own mandatory synthesis. Honestly, it makes you look at every single blade of grass and every rusting padlock out there a little bit differently. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. After all your frantic vibration, when that heavy silence finally inevitably comes for you, will you call it death, or will you call it a cure?